Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 97 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, my guest is Dr. Athena Kirk, a professor of classics at Cornell. Her research focuses on the intersections between literature and epigraphy and the material quality of ancient texts, as well as public interactions with them. She explores documents that seem to fluctuate between the traditional categories of text and object, and oral and written, perform poetry, drama, and inscribed decrees, for example, all depend on the written medium, yet could not exist solely within it. In this episode, we discussed her work on Plutarch and other favorite texts, differentiating text and object from text objects, and media reception and misconceptions of ancient works. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Awesome. Thanks so much for joining me this morning, afternoon. What is time anymore? I don't know. Anyway, I've been quite excited to have this conversation, and I would love if you could just start us off and tell us, when did you discover classics, or when did you get into ancient history and mythology and all the cool stuff?
That's a good question. It's great to be here, by the way. Thank you so much, Lexi, for having me. And I'm so delighted that I got to meet you in person before we recorded this. Although I had been exposed to stuff like Greek mythology as a child, I think my sort of first interest in classics was taking Latin. I had the good fortune and opportunity to have Latin from 7th grade. So I took it for a few years in junior high and then with a slight gap again in high school. And I think for me, it was that kind of philological puzzle, although I wouldn't have known any of that terminology at the time, of working out forms and meanings and putting it all together that really got me hooked. And so even though I didn't become a Latinist per se, that I think is what made me go on to study from a sort of linguistic standpoint in a way. And then I think I came back around to the literature and culture later.
Are you one of those people who just has a natural affinity for language? Did you really enjoy doing it? And then did you have a lot of opportunity? Because I know, nowadays not everyone gets exposed to the languages, which is really sad, but makes it kind of hard if you don't come to the languages until college.
Yeah, absolutely. I always really enjoyed it, but at the same time, as I said, I was lucky enough to be able to be exposed to that when I was 12 or 13, which is, even if it's not that critical early period of language learning, it's very different from trying to do that sort of rote memorization work and absorption of so many facts, even when you're 18 or 19. I think there's a really big difference in moment of life coming to it earlier and later. That is not to say that you cannot have great success coming to this at the beginning of college, but I think there is something that gets a little more internalized a little earlier. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. Although I went to a high school where ancient Greek was taught, I didn't take it there. I learned it after my first year of college in the just little plug here for the CUNY Latin and Greek intensive summer program, which was a really formative and wonderful experience for me, and I think is one of the many things that sort of propelled me into the field.
That's really cool. Also, I feel like you're the first person who said they offered ancient Greek before college. That is so rare. Most people will, if they have any ancient language, it's Latin. And it's one of those things that would be like funny if it weren't so sad. So I picked my high school because they had a Latin program. And then the year that I actually started in high school was the first year that they took the Latin program away. And they also took the German program away. So all I had was French.
I personally like French, but your story is tragic. That's what you chose it for, and then it wasn't there anymore. I think they did subsequently end the Greek program at my high school as well. And although I do feel sad about that on a personal level, I think there are ways in which we have to see the value of doing other things too. It's a difficult kind of issue for me, I think, because I obviously have devoted my life to the study of ancient languages, so I think it's really important. But I also think that it is in many cases okay for people to start this later. But I really, my heart goes out to you. That's a terrible story, Lexi.
I know. It's one I like to rip out, especially since I thought it hilarious that I ended up, being a classicist. And I was like, well, you tried everything apparently in your power to stop me, and I made it anyway. So,
Against all odds. Absolutely.
but so I love meeting people who liked doing the languages when they were younger, because there's so many people who, language is hard, and people are like, it's hard enough to do French and Spanish. I don't want to do all these other things. So, you said that you enjoyed them, which was awesome. But did you ever kind of confront that sort of existential question? I feel like most classicists to be end up thinking about, which is, do I stick with this because it's going to get harder and longer, or do I want to switch to maybe doing like archaeology because it's more material culture and it's not as much of the languages? Or did you just kind of know, like, nope, this is what I want to do. I like sticking with these.
No, I think I never knew either of those things. And maybe there's questions that I still have. As far as the choice, of language versus kind of a different path of study, I think to the contrary, I knew I wanted to stick with doing this sort of minute language stuff, but it was a struggle for me to actually branch out more. And learn more about history, learn more about culture, get context, literary context, for what I was reading. And so that, I think, is what really took me a long time. I was so kind of invested in this really close, small scale study. And, in some ways still am. It's still something that I struggle with in my own work today, to get a little bit beyond the text and really think about what this is doing in a bigger way. So that, I think, was one of the struggles for me. I considered other academic paths in college. Linguistics was one of them. I was interested in Indo-European, stuff like that. And then, believe it or not, classics seemed like the more practical path in that regard. But for me, yeah, I think it was kind of language and close reading of literature, which was how I was trained, I guess, in those years that I wanted to continue.
That's awesome. I mean, literature obviously is like a huge category. And then when you look at all the Greek and all the Latin texts, you're like, it can be overwhelming. So, how did you go about figuring out what within, was of particular interest to you? Because I did the same thing when I knew I didn't want to be an archaeologist. I was like, well, I like some texts, but there's a lot, and I don't know how I'm going to pick which ones to focus on. And of course, you have well, I could do Homer, but everyone loves Homer. And so it's decidedly less sexy if everyone wants to do Homer. So then you're like, ew, I don't want to do that, even though it's amazing. So, were these questions that like came up for you too?
Yeah, to some regard, it's funny to hear someone talk about Homer and say ew at the same time. I like that. As I said before, in some ways, I've never totally decided or focused. So when it came time to write a dissertation and later a book, I wrote something that was not about one author or one text. So could not really constrain myself in that way. And it is really difficult to decide. I think in earlier stages, I guess I just ended up gravitating toward the things that I enjoyed the words of the most, that I enjoyed the experience of reading the most, which didn't always accord with the content, which is sort of strange to say. So as an undergraduate, became really invested in Lucretius and loved reading that poetry, even though I wasn't particularly invested in philosophy, didn't really see myself kind of pursuing some Epicurean path, but I did end up writing an undergraduate thesis on Lucretius. And there was something I think I just really liked about reading that poetry, about his mode of expression, maybe because it had some Greek archaisms in the Latin, and I later ended up sort of shifting to the Greek side. It's hard to recreate my feelings at that time. And then, as I say later, I think I found it really hard to decide. I always sort of gravitated toward poetry, although I have incorporated more prose into my work too. And then once I guess you start thinking about themes, part of your work is cut out for you because there are texts out there, let's call them, that address those themes. But yeah, you always go back to your favorites, I guess. Homer still being one of mine. I had a really formative undergraduate tutorial on Pindar, who's an author that a lot of undergraduates don't have the opportunity to read. And I think that was again, even though I don't work on Pindar really now, a really something that I just loved reading at the time. And again, hooked me on Greek poetry.
Okay, so it's funny because while you were talking, I was just thinking maybe it's fresh in my mind because it happened at, SES, which happened, what was it, 3 weeks ago, something like that. But I realized in talking with so many people who do so many things, so many different, texts that I had either forgotten about or just don't think about, and really popular ones. I remember I kind of had this inner monologue in my head saying, oh, I think it's a sign that I've really arrived if I can fully participate in a conversation with people who do literature from both the Greek and the Roman side. And I can sort of play the game where I try to guess who's your favorite ancient author or what's your favorite text or those fun little things. And I remember there was a certain interaction with a grad student, and I just took one look and I said, okay, I'm gonna guess who your favorite Roman poet is based on knowing nothing about you other than like say one word, give me one hint, give me one time period. And it ended up being hilarious because I think I guessed every single person except the right one.
Oh
Uh,
no.
so that was a little awkward at the end, but then my excuse was I'm not a Latinist, so I don't know. I'm just pulling names out of a hat at this point. It would be easier if you were into Greek stuff, and I like to think that that would have been the case, but I actually have no idea. So, just from this fun interaction, I was like, is this something that can be related to or recreated on the scale that you do it with, since that is like your specialty? Do you get people asking you all the time, like, do you have a favorite text right now? Or I bet I know who your favorite ancient poet is based on, I don't know, one thing you said.
I don't know if anyone has ever said that particular thing to me, and maybe this is your entree into to that. To be honest, usually people, if they have one comment based on knowing very little about me, it's a comment about my name. There was someone I met at the SCS who I introduced myself to, or maybe another friend introduced me on my behalf. And they said, this is my friend Athena Kirk, and the person just sort of laughed. That's usually the point of entry. And then maybe people make certain inferences about authors I might like based on that. I don't know. Anyway, it sounded like this was an invitation for me to give you one hint or one word about something that's my favorite right now, but it's a strange one, the person that I'm thinking about at the moment.
I guess I didn't intend it, but if it accidentally got me to asking you a question that maybe a non-classicist would think would be a very pertinent question, then yes, you know what? I'm going to bounce onto it because I set myself up. So do you have a current favorite text or favorite author that you're working on right now?
Well, no, Lexi. No. Actually, although, as I said, I've spent a long time thinking about mostly archaic and classical poetry and prose to a certain extent, lately I've been thinking a lot more about Plutarch. So, still working in Greek, but a little later. Because I don't know, it's been a nice departure from me to think about an author who, in some ways, has nothing to do with the other texts that I tend to study, but in some ways, of course, has everything to do with them. And is talking about Greek stuff and classical stuff all the time. So I've been particularly interested in some of the Moralia essays that have to do with women and family. Maybe this is a life stage sort of thing for me at the moment. I don't know. But as I say, it's been kind of a departure for me from a lot of what I've worked on in the past. So probably not the answer you would have expected, but yeah, at the moment, kind of into Plutarch.
I'm making zero assumptions because I know how it goes. You read something, you come across something, it sparks an idea, a feeling, something, and then you realize, oh, okay, maybe actually this person or this text or something has what I'm looking for, interested in, and then you go off on the most wonderful academic tangent, and then you're like, well, this was a fun extrapolation. Don't know how I got here, or perhaps you do, and then you're like, unexpected. So I don't make any assumptions. I think having podcasted now for 3 years, I've learned there are certain patterns. There's not many because everyone's so unique. But, if I'm clearly dealing with someone who's like, I am an expert in Homeric poetry, I'm probably going to assume, like, yeah, you spend a lot of your time with Homer, relating things back to Homer. So that seems kind of like a gimme. But, if the category is broad enough, like just literature, I'm like, yeah, you can go anywhere. So, and that's kind of what I love about it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think that that's one of the wonderful things about this field, that on the one hand, as you said before, there are many authors, there's a lot to choose from. It's a very wide world. There's also the corpus is more limited than some other fields you can think of. But I think that gives us the ability to really be able to talk to each other, even across subfields sometimes. And it means that you also can jump around. You're not expected to be dedicated to the same author or genre or time period for your entire academic life. So that's something that I really appreciate about this field that I think isn't always the same across other fields in the humanities, or for that matter in the sciences, although I purport to know nothing about the sciences.
It's okay. I was shit at science my whole life. So. But I want to move a little into your own research and stuff that you've been working on, because I read somewhere and you've worked on sort of stuff with differentiating categories of text and also looking at text as objects themselves. And I find that really fascinating because I went just yesterday to see the Book of the Dead exhibit at the Getty. And I asked a friend of mine to show me around, and she was explaining that, it's not just the papyri, but they also wrote Book of the Dead stuff on the linen for wrappings. And so I remember thinking to myself, oh, that's so interesting, because it is a text because you would read it, but it is an object that you then put on the mummy, you put it on the person. So it's both text, but also an object that you would use and have in different contexts. And learning the history of that was really interesting. And so coming into today, I was like, oh, I need to bring this up, because obviously it's different in Egypt with that and in Greece and Rome. So I'd be fascinated to hear, how do you make that distinction, and what would have qualified in the classical lands, let's call them, because certainly we did not have mummies in Egypt or in Greece and Rome.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking the question, and especially for asking it in such an expansive and intelligent way. I'm going to be in LA in a couple of weeks, and I'm so sad that I'm just going to miss the end of that exhibit, because I was really excited to see it. But I am, and I have been really interested in the question of text and object and the question of sort of kind of text. So I'm actually just finishing as we speak this article about Eleusis that talks about the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which is all about Eleusis, even if we don't really know historically how much connection it had early on to Eleusis. And then about a couple of inscriptions, one big sort of inventory account inscription from Eleusis. And usually these are not the kinds of texts we think can talk to each other so easily or have even a lot of intertext between them. And I'm not really arguing that the authors of the inscription are thinking super seriously about the hymn. And of course, the composers of the hymn have nothing to do with this later inscription. And yet, I think if we think about these two kinds of texts together, and we try to maybe erase these boundaries of literature versus document, specifically authored text versus text that is part of the tradition, we can see some resonances. So what I'm thinking about there is who has archival authority at Eleusis. And we see in the inscription that this is vested in the hands of some male officials who are doing the work of figuring out, what they've got, where it's going to go, what the sacred monies are, and other kinds of protocols that other sorts of documents deal with. And then if we go back to the hymn, we're thinking about some of those same questions, I want to argue, except that all this kind of archival authority, the listing of names, the figuring out of who is important and what needs to be remembered, is vested in the figures of women. So there's sort of a gendered shift to be noticed there. And it's one that I think parallels these bigger gendered shifts that are happening in cult in Eleusis. So if Demeter and Kore, say, are these old figures of an earlier female-oriented cult, certainly by the time it's a pan-Hellenic cult, the initiates are not just women, are predominantly men. It becomes this kind of either co-opted or certainly shifted set of rituals and practices. So my point being, I think we can think about texts across boundaries that we tend to sort of keep apart, and bringing them together allows us to see some things that we otherwise wouldn't see. But as far as more object-oriented stuff is concerned, I mean, I've done some work with Greek inscriptions, and so stone and to some extent other hard materials on which things were inscribed have so much potential, I think, for our thinking about how the Greeks, if we're just talking about the Greeks, think about that distinction, right? I mean, do they look at an epigram and sit there and think to themselves, is this an object or is this a text? And yet they are so invested in the stone, right? The stone is speaking. They are so invested in maybe a dead person speaking behind a stone. They seem to engage themselves in those questions that allow us to think about what that support, let's say, right, that thing that the text is on, if we want to put it like that, is really doing. And even in some of my work, I've thought about this category of inscription. Like, is this something that in the ancient world people think of as separable from the object in the way that we do, right? We read these editions of texts all the time, and we think of the text as those words on the page that we can copy to any degree we want and change to a certain degree the format of. We can change the lineation, we can change the font, right? We can change the punctuation and all of these things that they didn't necessarily have the capacity to do. And yet we still think of that as a text, the text, right? And yet I think for the Greeks, for inscribed text in particular, so the category of epigraphe, this is something that really is inseparable from the thing that it's on and from the object. At the same time, as you know, they have this super robust tradition of texts that are oral predominantly, that are just in the air. And again, I'm speaking broadly across the centuries of ancient Greece, but I think there's endless amount of interest in thinking about those questions.
I mean, I really am fascinated by, your work there also because I do a lot of reception studies. And so I do spend a lot of my time thinking about, ancient and modern parallels. And so it was interesting because reading up on obviously what you've been working on, it's kind of struck me like, okay, yes, it's, one thing to look at how the ancients would have perceived things, but I was kind of looking at like, is there like a modern parallel? Like, so what would be a text today and what would be an object today? And so now I'm going to suggest something, and I would like you to tell me whether I'm close or if I'm just plain off. And so I was thinking, like, if I have a book, I would consider a book an object because it's something I can kind of pick up, and yeah, it has the text in it, but I can carry it around and do whatever. If I have the same exact story, but it's not in a book, if I look at it like on my computer screen and I'm just scrolling down on one page and it's just the text, I don't see that as an object. To me, that's a text. So I don't know. Is that a kind of parallel, but like a more modern one, or am I just off like completely?
No, I think that's a wonderful parallel. We exist in this digital world where we have all kinds of virtual things that I think still feel different to us from physical things to some degree, because we still have books around, thankfully. I'm so glad that they're still here. Although we know that our interaction with them, at least in my case, has diminished over the years. Your comparison is apt, and I think it is possible to say, okay, if you've got the physical book in your hand, that is an object. If you're looking at it on a screen, that is just a text. At the same time, we have done objectification, let's say thingification, right, of many, many more digital objects. And we have lots of things that are published digitally before they get printed, or maybe are not printed at all. And those are still books. Certainly. Are they objects? I don't know. But then you think about something like NFTs, like what is that? Is that an object? If it's something you can own and pay for, does it count as an object? And I don't want to go too far into the properties of what makes something an object, but definitely the category of text is really capacious. So all these things I think we can safely call texts. And then this issue of, what is medium, what is written versus not written. It was argued, I don't know, a couple of decades ago by the linguist David Crystal, who's really invested in this issue of medium, right? If there's oral versus written, then what do we do with texting and the internet, right? These are arguments from like 2008, right? I think we still haven't quite come up with an answer. I think his answer at the time was, all these digital platforms are a new kind of medium that exists somewhere in between. And I think that's got to be true. And yet it has also got to shift because of the ways we interact with them, right? As they become more familiar, and as we all become, if not digital natives, like us old people, as in I'm talking about myself and other old people, not you, does that definition shift, right? So I guess I say this because if we could go back and ask, I don't know, Herodotus some questions about what he thinks about medium and explain to him what these distinctions are, he might have very different opinions about the media available to him than we have about the media available to him, right? Because we exist in such a different landscape. Sort of a vague direction to go in answering your question, but I'm glad to hear that you still make some distinction, right? That maybe you're not like my first year undergraduate students to whom there seems to be no difference, between having a physical copy and having an ebook. The idea, I mean, even saying ebook, I think sometimes sounds antiquated, and I don't always make them have a physical copy. And yet it's the only way to ensure that everybody is looking at the same edition sometimes.
You bring up a very interesting point. And also, wow, undergrads these days, man, what are these kids being taught? Today's youth.
I can vouch for what they're being taught, but not what they're learning, maybe.
Okay, yes, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, no, I mean it's fascinating because I guess I mean it's not like I spend a lot of time either sitting here being like, what is an object? But maybe I'm old school in the way that if I can tangibly touch it or have it, transport it, whatever, then it's an object to be taken and transported and whatever. But I personally am like, no, I listen to audiobooks because I love them, but I don't see them as objects. They're just being read to me in the three-dimensional space. I don't know.
Well, that brings I think yet another dimension into the picture of the audiobook, right? As opposed to just the digital book. I know my mind is blown. I also really like audiobooks. The experience of Homer, I should say, going back to your previous to some of our previous topics, the audiobook experience of Homer, I think, is something not to be missed. And speaking of undergraduates, I always encourage them to listen to their Homer. You really pick up on so many different things. And even if it's not exactly like the ancient rhapsodic or bardic experience, I think it brings us a little closer to what it might have been like to be an ancient audience. That's just an aside.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I mean, yeah, I spend a lot of time with audiobooks, but not thinking about them and like how they're changing education and other things. It's true. Like, but this is why it's fascinating to see classics mix with like more digital multimedia approaches to teaching material, learning material, absorbing material, both intentionally and unintentionally. So I'm excited to see kind of what new technology comes out and what new ways people are going to interact with texts. And then will text remain texts traditionally in that sense, or do we have to create new categories and stuff? But one old category that I find are awesome and unique are like the idea of the ancient Roman curse tablets. And I'm just curious, like to you, because I know what they're for. You're supposed to write the thing and do the curse and the whatever, and then you like burn it or whatever. But is that a text? Is that a object where you just put writing on it? Like I'm perpetually intrigued by what is the nature of this one thing because it does two different things, it seems.
Oh gosh, it's a great example. If we're talking about like lead tablets that are rolled up, or maybe, deficciones or something, this is clearly more than just a text, right? This is an object. This has agency. It's interesting because the text is supposed to do stuff on its own, right? So magical incantation, magical language is supposed to have this effect, and yet they seem to be making sure that that will happen in some very physical ways as well. So again, if you're using some sort of chthonic poisonous substance, I guess they didn't really know it was poisonous, but and you're burying it under the ground or whatever they're doing, yeah, there's got to be something more at play there. And when I think about that stuff, it's also the combination of text and object, let's say, into this one sort of super text object that seems to have this really powerful magical agency, right? These really powerful possibilities. I should say a shout out to PhD student in my department, Sophia Taborski, who's writing a dissertation on curse tablets and thinking about their interaction with the body, and all of these kinds of agency related questions. Yeah, it's a fascinating example, maybe one of the most fascinating. And gets us into the question of materials as well. Again, clearly there's an attention to the writing materials that they're using that have much more to do, that have to do with many things that are not just the things we think about with writing materials, right? So how available were they? How fancy are they? What kind of affordances do they have for our ability to write things down in the ways we want to? There's a lot more thinking about it than that. The quarrying of marble and certain kinds of marble, right? Yes, there are certain, affordances to the way things get chiseled on certain kinds of marble, and yet there seems to be more aesthetic interest at play, and there seems to be some kind of symbolic and interest of value at play.
Well, I'm glad to know that experts who actually study things like this are also equally fascinated by curse tablets. Because I know sometimes I'm like, oh man, is this just one of those funny things from the ancient world that somehow has become a fixation? But people are like, chill, it's just a curse tablet. But good to know that the experts are actually also just as interested. Makes me feel like I'm on the right track.
100%.
And I've got to imagine, especially when you're dealing more with literature and for Hollywood standards, it's decidedly unsexy to show epigraphy in any way. Like oh yes, show it in media and then make it sexy, and you're like, oh, that's a tall order. I don't know how to do that. But they do a great job of showing the curse tablets in the HBO Rome TV show, because you see Sevilla, I think she's like, inscribing on the lead tablet, and you hear her, so she's speaking it aloud, and you see her writing it and rolling it, and it takes something that the general public might not be super familiar with, and it popularizes it, and it shows us, hey, these are cool smaller things you wouldn't think about, and this is something that happened in the ancient world. And so since it's kind of a struggle, right, with every new generation coming in, it's a challenge, right, for classicists everywhere to, if you're going to engage with them, you got to kind of meet them at their entry points, meet them where they are. And a lot of people, I'm discovering now, they come to the ancient world through watching popular media. And so, for something like literature and epigraphy that doesn't lend itself right to, glorious battles and some of the other stuff, do you think there is a way to highlight the literature by not just straight up retelling the story or shedding light onto it, kind of the way that Rome did with the curse tablets? Because this is something that I spend way too much of my time thinking about. Like, how do we show people that a lot of the subspecialties within classics are amazing and awesome, but like it just doesn't seem like a natural thing for a film or whatever.
I'm so glad you asked this, and I'm so glad you reminded me. I haven't watched Rome in such a long time, but it's great to think about. And now these other episodes of that show are coming back to me, but I will not be distracted by those. Anyway, yeah, I think so. Leaving aside, literature and our traditional definition of that part of the subfield for the moment, which I think some students are already interested in because they've been able to access it before in certain ways. I find that a lot of students are really excited about stuff like epigraphy and papyrology, at least from the material kind of perspective. They're really interested in learning about this stuff. So, full disclosure, I teach a course on the history of writing, which spans, all the way back from Sumerian cuneiform and goes all the way to like emoji and, however things are changing digitally right now. So it tries to cram a lot into the semester. I don't know, sort of embarrassingly, but also it's because I wanted to have this to have a much more global sort of reach. Our Greece and Rome alphabet days are pretty limited. We don't spend, we could spend I could spend an entire semester talking to the students about the Greek alphabet, but actually part of the aim of the course is to downplay what I think have been some narratives in the history of writing, giving such supreme importance to the alphabet. So like not classicists even, but media historians, Kittler comes to mind, had really aggrandized the Greek alphabet as the pinnacle of writing and writing systems in these problematic ways, right? Culturally problematic ways that cause people to think that somehow alphabets are better than other kinds of writing systems, which is patently untrue, or that we've somehow teleologically arrived at certain alphabet, and you can imagine all the ways in which that is problematic. So we try to push against that in this course. But one of the things the students really love doing the most is just working with these materials. So these are students who know, nothing about the ancient languages, or they're, some of them might, but there's 70 students, say, in this class who come from all over the university. And, by gosh, if they don't all really enjoy, they always say that this was the most fun part, sitting there. They make clay tablets with cuneiform, right, with styli. They love that process and seeing how it works. They make papyrus sheets, right? So we get some papyrus strips, and they, learn how to put them together, and then they write on them again with a stylus and ink of some kind. And they also, in that class, we get so they don't chisel things on stone. We haven't quite gotten to the capability of that yet. But what they have done is make squeezes. So that is to say, for listeners who might not know this kind of inside baseball classics stuff, they make paper impressions out of kind of chemical paper, like filter paper, that they wet and press into the squeeze. So it's a little bit, in some ways, like making a rubbing, except that what you get is a 3D impression of the stone in relief, so backwards, once the paper has dried. And they really enjoy that process. And then they really enjoy seeing how you can study, if we're talking about objects, the real 3D materiality of that thing. And then it teaches them a lot about the history of understanding text, right? Because you talk to them about a time when high quality, high res photography was not available for the study of these kinds of texts. And even now we know that a squeeze can give you a lot more and more accurate information in some cases than high res photography. Certainly, like the kinds of digital imaging that is possible now with inscriptions was not possible. So I think it really introduces them not only to the interesting world of what handling and working with these materials is like, but the world of how historically we've come to be able to study these sorts of texts, and how that sort of study has changed with the technologies we have. Yeah, I mean, I think actually, although if they wanted to really seriously get into the subfields of papyrology and epigraphy, there's a whole lot of background learning that needs to happen. There are some really surface ways that students can get invested in those things. And then later, if they choose to, delve much deeper into the language and history.
I do love hands-on approaches. Also, the course just sounds fantastic, and it just also makes me very, very sad and very angry that I am nowhere near Cornell and I cannot take this class. I cannot audit this class. Man, I would show up so fast to learn all about writing. So you have very lucky students, and I am very jealous. Let that go on record.
Oh, you're very kind. I would love to have you there someday. And it really is one of my favorite courses to teach. And I'm actually really excited that it's going to be a version of it is going to be piloted by someone else, our active learning postdoc in the department, Alan Van Den Aren, in Cornell's prison education program. So it's exciting that it's going kind of further, it's having some further reach than just Cornell right now.
You know what? Having talked to several of your colleagues, I've just determined that I think Cornell has what I have determined in all of my extensive research, not really, are the coolest course offerings. I mean, I know there's that like appreciation of wine course you guys got over there. And I'm like, a class where you can just go drink wine sounds very unfair and very cool. So I'll just add it to the list of cool classes that you guys have. It's truly an impressive list. Yeah, goodness me.
Thanks, Lexi. I feel very lucky to be part of this department. Really, really great colleagues and interesting people. And yeah, I also wish that I could take more of their courses.
Yeah, that would be pretty hard, right? Like you have so many great colleagues with great things that they're working on, and then you're like, oh, but I can't take that myself. Darn, I'm too busy.
It is tough, although we do visit each other's classes sometimes, which is a nice thing about one of the many nice things about this department.
One day maybe I'll get myself up and over to Cornell and just have to kind of float around and visit every class and get into. Yeah, so we're getting toward the back half, just to be cognizant of time for the both of us. So I'm gonna kind of wind us short and sort of end us with, well, I have to ask because, well, I'm very curious. Have you played or seen footage of or done anything with the recent Assassin's Creed Odyssey game?
No, big no, but this has nothing to do with any particular bias toward Assassin's Creed or Assassin's Creed Odyssey or the people who play it. I am just true to classicist form in some senses. I'm a pretty big Luddite when it comes to video games, social media, many things like that. So no, but I would love to hear more about it from you.
I mean, I only ask because, while big budget Hollywood films, since basically nobody has the budget that the HBO Rome did, and it's hard to do that. I wanted to just point out that, in case you were unaware, they do a great job of recreating like everyday life in ancient Greece. And so when you go walk around some of the markets, the agoras, the towns, especially like in Athens, you see like ordinary people working on ordinary things. And so it's really fun. You can walk around and you can see people making vases, and you see them writing on tablets and stuff. And then you'll see there's like piles of tablets that are written on. And then you go, oh, I wonder, where's this going to be shipped? There's one sequence where it's like you can go visit the ruins of Knossos, and like down in the sort of basement, there's a bunch of tablets like spread all over the floor. And I'm like, wait, I wish I could pick those up. I want to see what would they. And so just the detail I thought was interesting. And so considering that you specialize in some of the more smaller everyday life things that we may not put on the silver screen all the time, they have that in the game. And so, I'm just fascinated to see, how can we think of using the technology and the things that are available to us to help get supplemental material for classroom use and other things. So that's the only reason I asked, because so if you didn't know, you can go find cool everyday things happening in that game.
No, thank you so much for telling me. And this is a great way. As I get older, it becomes more and more difficult to connect on a pop cultural level, specifically with my students. So I definitely will and should do that. This sounds like a better way to show them a dramatization of what was going on then. For example, the 2004 film Troy, which I still show them mostly as a kind of as a joke to make us laugh after we've read the Iliad, which they really enjoy, and which, it's 2024, right? It's 20 years old now. So they definitely haven't seen for the most part. But yeah, it sounds like this might be a little better connection that I could forge. Thank you, Lexi.
Happy to help. So, kind of to end the interview portion of the podcast, I just have two quick questions. And the first one is, when you were a student, either in undergrad or in grad school, did you attend office hours?
Probably, but probably not very often. I have to admit that I don't think I was the best student all the time in either my undergrad or graduate years. I did sometimes attend office hours for the worst possible reason, which is if I missed class. And now, it's really coming around to get me on the karmic side, because of course I'm always on the brink of saying to a student, office hours are not the time to rehearse what, and yet I really don't have a leg to stand on in this regard. So sometimes, but not as often as I should have, and not for the right reasons.
It's okay. Many people, the majority, honestly, of people I went to school with, and I was in undergrad between 2013 and 2018, so not too long ago. Really, I want to say maybe 5 people I knew went to office hours. So I don't think it's anything new to not go. So don't feel too bad. All that to say,
Okay.
don't feel too bad. Okay, so for this next question, you can draw on your experience as an educator yourself if you would like to. But, do you have a favorite, conversation or moment or something that really stands out from an office hours chat?
I have to say, I love when students come to office hours. And I think post-pandemic, it's become rarer because everybody has gotten more used to, to interacting less, and certainly to interacting less in person, and even on Zoom, if those office hours are available on Zoom. So if any students are listening out there, whether they're mine or students elsewhere, you should go to office hours. It's great. And really, I almost always enjoy the interactions in office hours. So some of the conversations I like the most are, ones where a student has gotten invested in a particular thing that we're studying and wants to take it further, or is connecting it to something they did before. Those are kind of these magical moments where you really see yeah, connections being forged and an engagement with the material that is not just what we're thinking about in class, but associating it with the bigger sphere of knowledge that the students have, which is the entire point. So I love those conversations. I really enjoy talking to students these days about either what has brought them to thinking about, classics or another course that I'm teaching, or what has not brought them there, like if they want to study something else, which invariably many of my students do, what it is that I hate to say, they're getting out of classics or gaining from it, but what it is that draws them to it, even if it's not their primary field of study, because I think it's so important to reach students who are doing all kinds of different things, right? Not everybody has to go and do this for a career, but it's so important for people to think about what they can gain from this. By the way, I should say this is a conversation that has been, we think of it as a more recent conversation about the humanities and the crisis in the humanities and all of this stuff. And yet I will tell you that I came across an article in the New York Times the other day. Don't ask why I was looking at such an old issue, from literally the 1850s, I think, in which a letter to the editor was written, and the writer said, why are we teaching these dead languages? They don't have to do with anything anymore. People don't need to be learning them. You can go and be a totally successful chemist and not have to do this stuff. And the New York Times editorial staff, I suppose, responded to say, we don't agree with the content of this letter. We think that there's all kinds of things to be gained, and basically said the equivalent of critical thinking, all these things that we say today. It's a recurrent conversation. But again, I do think that it's really interesting to talk to students about what they like about this, even if they study a whole bunch of other things.
No, those are some of the best conversations, honestly. I admit I used mine not just strictly for academic help, which is what they're for. I burst into my favorite professor's office hours one day and essentially almost started crying. And she was like, "What's going on?" And I was like, "I'm going to jail because I don't know how to do my taxes." And she was like, "Oh, poor you." And then she was like, "Here, have chocolate from my chocolate drawer and I will teach you how to do your taxes." And I was like, "Oh, this is amazing." And then from then on, I never left her office. I just lived there and asked if I could do everything other than sleep there, essentially.
That is above and beyond. Certainly, I don't know that I would recommend anyone ask me personally how to do their taxes, but totally, I'm so glad you found that person. And it sounds like a very generous soul who was willing to share that information with you.
She was one of the best professors. I mean, she was like this teensy tiny, 70 something year old woman and she was so old school. I mean, here we are, and it was what, 2017, 18. And here she is with her little manual projector and the plastic slides. And she was like, "I refuse to use this newfangled computer system. It hurts my eyes. I get dry eye." And we're like, "Oh, you are kind of a relic in a classics department. So you are 10 times more special. This is incredible." Love her. Anyway, yeah, that's a really good reason to go visit office hours, though, for all those wonderful reasons. Also, it's just fun to get to know your professors. Honestly, they're interesting people. They have cool things to say. So I always tell people, go to office hours. So at the end of each episode, I ask if all of my guests will read Shelley's Ozymandias poem. And, this is a very complex poem, so I'm not expecting you to analyze it, the way it could be. But, just what are some initial thoughts you have? Do you like the poem? Do you agree that it's pretty powerful and cool? Or you're like, "Nah, it's just a poem."
No, it's not just a poem. It's an amazing poem. And, it lends itself, it has lent itself to so many different readings. It's wonderful. One of the things that's great about it, and maybe I'll read it first and say the rest of this, but is we've been talking about physicality today. And this is, seems to be, if we believe this story about Shelley, seeing stuff in the British Museum, right? This is a poet who's responding to physical objects. Anyway, I'll read it and then maybe we can talk more. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of old command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. We've been talking about texts and objects and inscriptions, and clearly that's what we're looking at here, or thinking about, or hearing about. Ramses II, I think. And what I think is funny in a way about this poem is that we go through this whole thing where the poem has shown us so clearly this intersection of text and object, right? The legs are vast and trunkless and like half sunk, a shattered visage. Okay, this person, let's say this person sculpture is fragmented, and there seems to be a break between that and the inscription, which and the things which yet survive, right? Which is the name, which is the honorific inscription, the speaking object, let's say. And so we end, I think, in this sort of depressed place, right? Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, right? It's very kind of dark, and there seem to be maybe some anxieties on the part of the poetic voice, right, about what might remain. This is certainly a pretty pervasive English 19th century kind of anxiety. You think of Keats, right? When I have fears that I may cease to be, kind of stuff. Okay, and yet at the same time, this thing is here. You just saw it, right? You have now immortalized it in your own poem. And it's something that all of these people are going to see if we can momentarily leave aside these uglier questions of colonialism and where this material should be. Certainly, it's getting a lot of visibility, and certainly there's these ways in which Ozymandias is going to be alive again, and we're hearing the voice come through the stone and then through Shelley. So in a way, there's something very optimistic about this text object, or this, for remaking this old text object. And then the fact that we have it mediated once again, right? I met a traveler from an antique land who said, right, who told us about this thing. So that remediation, I think, is really interesting too, if we're thinking about media objects and text objects here. So, even if there's some idea of, I don't know, fallen glory or something here, that's not the impression that I leave it with at all. And the last thing I will just say is that I wasn't thinking about this poem years ago when I wrote something about inscriptions that I was talking about before. I wrote about, what do Greeks mean when they talk about an epigraphe? Is it a text or is it an object? And is it separable from the object or not? And one of the conclusions I came to at the end of that article, that I don't really know if it's true, was that an inscription in the Greek consciousness is sort of like a stamp. It's kind of like something that is sort of separate, but you stamp it on an object and they become one thing. And then on its own, a stamp on its own doesn't really do anything, right? We have to put it on something. So I love the line about those passions red, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, really gets me about this poem. So thanks for bringing me back to it and making me read it again after a long time.
Happy to do so. I mean, honestly, it's been my favorite poem since I first read it, and I can't remember if that was either in high school or college. I want to say high school, but I really can't remember. But all I know is the first time I heard it, I was like, nope, that's it. That's the best. That's my favorite. So, and yeah, no, I love it, especially for the political undertones too of, the time Shelley was writing, but also, are you commenting on power? What's the nature of power? All power, political power, any power? And, it attacks the heart of monumentality. It's a monumental structure, but also, does it stay standing? No, it doesn't. It's broken clearly from the text. And so, kind of thinking about it metaphorically in all these different ways. And I'm like, oh, it's such a memento mori. I wonder if we have more of those floating around today. And so the last question that I developed for this show really developed off of the idea of memento mori. So, if you take a minute and think about culture today, do we have a modern equivalent of an Ozymandias? Like something we think is amazing and great. But, future humans, when they find us, will they agree? Will they be like, those people were crazy?
Mm-hmm. I think they probably will. But yeah, I'm sure we have a lot of these things, but it's a lot harder to see them sometimes when you're in the midst of them, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree. You know what? Everything Even just humanity is a great answer to that, because sometimes I'm like, ah, humans are ridiculous.
Yeah, I should try to think of something more specific.
Doesn't have to be. I tell people all the time, it can be random. It can be a big sort of theoretical thing. It can be a tangible thing. It can be an idea. There's no right or wrong here.
Well, as far as imperial powers are concerned, whichever ones we're thinking about in the poem, certainly I think there's ways in which it's easy to see the potential crumbling of many of them today. So maybe we'll just leave it there without getting too dark.
It's fine. I don't ask that everyone get very polemic about poetry at the end, because that would be depressing. And sometimes people have rip out answers that are just depressing in and of itself. So I'm like, okay, well, that's awesome. But to end on a slightly happier note, I did kind of lie. There's one other question I will ask, but it's very simple, and that is, where can people find you if they would like to, find your work, or email you and talk about taking a class, maybe studying with you as a grad student?
Yeah, you are welcome to contact me by email. You can find my email on the Cornell website. It's got a bunch of numbers, so maybe I won't go through it right now. But yeah, please reach me by email if you want to get in touch. I would love to hear from you.
Well, I will link that in the show notes. Do you have an academia page?
No, this goes part and parcel of my aversion to social, or whatever you want to call academia, academic, social media. So no, it's terrible.
It's okay. No,
Sorry.
it is not a requirement in any way. Academia at this point is acting more like a weird version of LinkedIn, but with fewer things. It's a weird thing. So, nope.
You have waited it out long enough.
Exactly. So I'm like, ah. And anyway, who knows? Social media might not be around in 200 years. So it's fine.
Neither will I, but
That too. So, well, none of us will be. So luckily, whew. But yes, I will make sure to link your faculty page in the show notes so they can find you, see the things you've worked on, and then send you an email if they so wish to ask a question or otherwise. But thank you so much for doing this with me. I was so delighted to be able to actually meet you in person before we got this recording in. That was a very unexpected surprise.
thank you so much. Likewise, this was great, and I'm so grateful again to you for having me on the show. It's wonderful. It's so great that you do this, and yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.